We appreciate him so much. All right, so we're going to move right along to our next speaker.
Thank y'all.
First time I met this lady, we had a rally here, and she came in, brought her horse. Her horse was standing right over here during the entire rally. And we thought that was just the coolest thing to see in the world, that she'd come in, and we started to get to know her. Over the time, she's helped out with saving the Alamo Cenotaph and working against the Reimagine the Alamo project. She's running for Congressional District 23. So I'd like y'all to welcome Dr. Alma Arredondo Lynch.
I'm sorry, he did it. Thank you, West. No, I need to. Oh, it's nice.
Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Don Hopkins, for being here, and safe journeys. Vaya con Dios.
Man, can we turn the mic up a little bit for her?
I'm going to have a little different perspective here. I want to go back before we had the Battle of the Alamo. I want to go back and bring you all up to date to the time when we had a commandant that was overseeing or actually mistreating people at the Alamo and in San Antonio. And I'm going to be talking about Joaquin Arredondo. And it's not by accident that I have that last name. We actually, my ancestors come from the same place where he settled back down in Mexico. I don't know if there's a relationship there or not. I haven't researched it yet. But, and I'm not trying to be racist here, but we always say James Bowie, all of these other guys. But you know what? We had Tejanos that died inside that Alamo, inside the walls of the Alamo. And I want to remember them too, because they played a very vital role. Juan Seguin. Yeah. It's sad how Juan Seguin ended. Yeah. But many of you do not know that the reason he was not inside the Alamo was because Juan Seguin was very well versed in the territory. He knew all the veredas, all the senderos. He knew all the trails to all the different villages at the time, all the little small towns. And that's why they kept him out there, because they needed him to send couriers to these areas when they needed help. So Juan Seguin played an incredible role. We also had others that died inside the Alamo. And yes, we hear that there's a certain number, but what you don't know is the night before, we had Tejanos jumping inside to the cuartel to fight with the Americanos. Right. They didn't have any names. They were decapitated, they were murdered, they were burned. So we don't know actually how many died in there, but there was a lot of Tejanos that gave up their lives for that. Now, I'm going to be talking to you about Joaquin Arredondo. He was a very cruel commandant. And I'm going to take you back. This is known the bloodiest battle in Texas. The Battle of Medina, and this took place 10 miles outside San Antonio. What you don't know is that the Americanos and Tejanos were out there trying to keep Joaquin Arredondo from approaching. But Joaquin Arredondo managed to form a pincers and surround these men that were out there fighting. And the men that were out there fighting, there was a total of 1,400 men. Out of those 1,400, 1,300 were killed. So only 100 survived. And those that were alive were executed. And as Joaquin Arredondo approached this area, those that he felt had helped the insurrection were executed. And he did not spare men, women, and children. He murdered all of them. When he got to San Antonio, what he did was he picked about 300 of those men and he dragged them all around the little streets here in this area, in this villa. And after they were killed, their heads were chopped off, their arms were chopped off, and their legs were chopped off, and they were hung from limbs of trees and posts, just like you would find them at a meat packing place. And that started instilling fear in the village of San Antonio. Imagine that. So he would take 3 men out of these prisons every day. Every day he would drag them, kill them, decapitate them, and remove their limbs and hang them up. If that didn't instill fear in you, it should have by now. Not only that, but Joaquin Arredondo had declared that they had mastered the grounds and owned the ground of the enemies. So, you say, well, what happened to the women? Here in San Antonio, they had churches. There was a church. So he would pile all of these men inside these churches where they were all standing up. There was no room to lay down or anything. And you could hear these men moaning and groaning because they were injured. And the women would hear these men crying. Amongst those men were their husbands. And the children were left outside the walls. Imagine it being in February. The weather was very cold. These children were without their mothers and fathers. The wives were without their husbands. The men were inside these church prisons, and they couldn't lay down. All the pain they felt and they hurt, and the children were starving outside. But Santa Ana had the women grind. He would have them grind approximately 40, a bushel, which is equivalent to 56 pounds. So they were having to make tortillas with this corn, and it was a total of 1,344 pounds of corn daily to feed his military. Imagine that. 1,344 pounds of corn being mashed with metates to feed all these men. I don't know about you guys, but when I make tortillas, my hand hurts. And that's because my palote is round and smooth. The women were raped, they were ridiculed by his soldiers. And Joaquin Arredondo didn't care. And he kind of enjoyed that. He was a very cool individual. There was one woman by the name of Arocha. And Arocha was heard telling the women around her that she would like to get Joaquin Arredondo's stomach and make it into a drum. So Joaquin Arredondo asked to see if the woman was brave enough to come forward and admit that she had said that. And Mrs. Arocha came out and she said, I am the one. I want to take your stomach or your belly and make it into a drum. And he said, ma'am, excuse me for being so gross. He says, but my huevos would better serve you alive. But what he did with that woman, he pulled her out of the prison and allowed her to join the other ladies to start making tortillas. When women rebelled, because the men would come by and pick the women and and rape them, and women started rebelling and they would lock arms, they would get the leader of that pack, that one woman, and they would prop her up on top of that wall and they would strip her naked. Imagine the weather being so cold and she would be stripped up there. I'm completely covered with my duster and I'm very cold. So after this, Joaquin Arredondo left.
Keep going. You're good.
Okay, Joaquin Arredondo left San Antonio because they recalled him because on the first battle, he was defeated very, very badly. But we also need to remember that the Battle of the Alamo was not so much because we wanted independence. We didn't want to go under the new leadership of Santa Anna, who was declaring himself a monarch. And Texas did not want to have that. They wanted to have the Mexican Constitution. And on top of that, besides he plundered all the surrounding ranches until he had nothing left. All the ranches had lost all their cattle. The Indians, the Comanches and the Kiowas and the Apaches were plundering every one of the ranches in the area. So there was a battle going on, not only with the Mexicans and the Spaniards, but it was with the indigenous tribes. And so San Antonio had a very, very rough beginning. And I think that we all need to dwell on that too. And I thank you so much for listening to my story. Oh, by the way, I am running for Congressional District 23. And I'm ready for this to be over on Tuesday, but I have to tell you a story. Yesterday it was colder than it is today. And every one of the candidates would run out to the line. I was at IGO library, and there was like 100 people waiting in line, and it was an hour and a half before they could vote. So while everybody says, vote for me, I do this, I do that, I would walk up to them and say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but let me give you a little bit of the history of San Antonio. I said, you all are experiencing some very cold weather. The night before the Battle of the Alamo, our men that fought for Texas freedom behind those walls were having to fight this kind of weather, perhaps worse. And they didn't have the wool caps, they didn't have the coats, they didn't have anything, and their wood supply was running low. So I hope you all appreciate and you all go vote for the best candidate to represent you. But remember, this is Texas, and you're right at the cradle of freedom right here in San Antonio. So remember the men and the women that died here at the Alamo. Thank you. This is Dr. Alamo Arredondo Lynch.